Well, hello YouTube members, Patreons, and I think for the first time, Pacific War Week by Week listeners. Yes, you heard that right. This was intended to be an exclusive episode to join, I think we're at about 29 exclusive episodes over my YouTube membership and my Patreon. But since I was also drawing to the very end of the Pacific War Week by Week series, I felt compelled to make some special episodes to answer some of the bigger questions. Why did Japan, or better said, why did Emperor Hirohito decide to finally surrender? It seems kind of obvious on the face of it, but there is actually a lot more to it than just 2 atomic bombs or the Soviet invasion. Now, for you Pacific War Week by Week listeners, this is probably a little bit different. I'm off the cuff. I'm not reading as much from the script as I usually do. For you Pacific War Week by Week listeners, as it is drawing to a close, I believe we have about 5 episodes left until the end of the entire series, maybe you could consider joining my YouTube membership or my Patreon. Hell, honestly, just toss $5 one month, download all the episodes, and leave. It won't hurt my feelings. I absolutely love doing these episodes that are directed at you guys, the fans, exactly what you want to hear more about, and a lot of you have come up with some interesting subjects. It's made for great episodes. For example, the 4-part series covering the life of Ishiwara Kanji, that was a fan suggestion, and it's one of my favorite episodes I ever worked on. So look at this as a bit of a teaser. And as for you YouTube members and patrons, don't worry, you're getting an extra episode this month. I wasn't going to skip out on the exclusive. So it's a bonus for everybody. So please, before we start, consider joining the YouTube membership or the Patreon over at www.patreon.com/PacificWar channel. By doing so, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, episodes just like this one. You get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. All proceeds go directly to my new animators that cost far too much for me to cover. Honestly, I'm losing money hand over fist each month, and it is scaring me. So also, if you have a chance, please check out my YouTube channel and check out some of my new content, as my animators, they're doing a great job. I don't want to say it's on par with Kings and Generals, but it's getting close. But anyway, stating all of that, let's just jump right into it. Why did Japan surrender during World War II? I think we need to first start off by briefly looking at one Emperor Hirohito. Now, upon taking the throne, Emperor Hirohito in 1926 inherited a financial crisis and a military that was increasingly seizing control of governmental policies. From the beginning, despite what many of you older audience members may have been told, Hirohito intensely followed all military decisions. Hirohito chose when to act and when not to. When the Kwangtung army assassinated Jiang Zuolin, he indulged their insubordination. This emboldened them to invade Manchuria in a false flag operation in 1931, whereupon Hirohito was absolutely furious and he demanded they be reined in. Real attempts were made, but they were heavily undermined by radicals. Hirohito could have put his foot down, but he chose not to. On September the 22nd, at 4:20 p.m., Hirohito said to the Imperial Japanese Army Chief of the General Staff at the time, Kanea Hanzo, "Although this time it couldn't be helped, the army had to be more careful in the future." Thus, Hirohito again acquiesced to the military, despite wanting them to stop or at least localize the conflict. The military had disregarded his direct wishes. They should have been severely punished, but he just slapped them on the wrist. Why did Hirohito not take a firmer stance? Again, for my older audience members, and I'm not trying to insult you, there's a valid point to be made here, as people, I'd say, at the age of 40 or above, were led to believe a certain narrative about why Japan surrendered, and we're going to get into it later, but it's a bit of a myth. Many of you older audience members probably heard something like, Hirohito was a hostage at the whim of his own military. It's some kind of narrative that made it seem like he was a hostage emperor. This was absolutely not the case. In fact, Hirohito was instrumental in many military decisions from 1931 to 1945. The reason why, and I'll call it here a myth, went on was because after Japan's surrender, the United States basically rewrote the Japanese constitution and covered up the emperor's involvement in all the nasty stuff, so as to maintain control over Japan. And yes, this sounds like Alex Jones level kind of conspiracy stuff, but I assure you, this is not the case. This narrative held firm all the way up until Hirohito's death, when, finally, some meeting notes and a lot of personal accounts, especially from Kido, that was his personal aide, they all came out, illuminating a lot. Though to this very day, many of those records are still red-taped. They're hiding information. Now, the reason as to why Hirohito did not stamp down his foot has to do with one thing: the Kokutai. So before I carry on, I have to explain what exactly is this term, the Kokutai. The Kokutai loosely translates to national essence. It refers to the qualities that distinguish the Japanese identity. It's what makes the Japanese Japanese, as they say. However, this concept is remarkably vague and poorly defined. Even Japanese historians acknowledge its ambiguity. In contrast to the Kokutai is the seitai, or the form of government. While the Kokutai embodies the eternal and immutable aspects of Japanese polity, rooted in history, traditions, and customs centered around the emperor, the seitai had evolved significantly throughout its extensive history alongside it. For instance, shoguns governed for over 700 years until 1868. They would be seen as a seitai, whereupon the Meiji Restoration reinstated the direct rule of the emperor. Nevertheless, Emperor Meiji's direct authority came to an end with the adoption of the Meiji Constitution of 1889, which established a constitutional monarchy, introducing significant complexities into the governance system. To give you an example, Article 4 of the Constitution declared, "The emperor is the head of the empire, combining in himself the rights of sovereignty, uniting the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, although subject to the consent of the imperial diet." Now, under this framework, the emperor alone possessed the power to appoint or dismiss ministers of state, declare war, negotiate peace, conduct treaties, direct national administration, and command the army and navy. Yet a glaring flaw in this arrangement is the inherent ambiguity of the Meiji Constitution. While it established a democratic parliament, it simultaneously afforded the emperor absolute authority to usurp it. The document failed to clearly define the relationship between the executive, legislative, and the judicial branches, and its language was intentionally made vague. Most critically, the military, that being the army and the navy, were not directly accountable to the civilian government. Instead, the emperor controlled them. So with the Kokutai, the emperor is a divine figure who embodies the state's sovereignty. It was not necessarily the emperor's job to surrender on behalf of the official government of Japan, but he most certainly could do so, given the Japanese people still remained faithful to the Kokutai. Now, Hirohito did not live an ordinary life. According to imperial customs of the day, Japanese royals were raised apart from their parents. At the age of 3, he was placed in the care of the Kawamura family, who vowed to raise him to be unselfish, persevering in the face of difficulties, respectful of the views of others, and immune to fear. One thing that was absolutely indoctrinated into him was to defend the Kokutai. It was his top mission as monarch. It was actually his only mission in many ways. At the very core of how he saw the world and how he acted, it was always to protect the Kokutai. For simplicity's sake, because I know a lot of you are still scratching your head, think of the Kokutai as this. It is the authority of the imperial household. It is his right as divine ruler. So when the Japanese military began these insubordinate acts in the 1930s, Hirohito's primary concern was the Kokutai, anything that threatened his imperial authority and the imperial institution itself. Although the military usurped his authority, the operations had been successful. Hirohito was not at all opposed to seeing his empire expand. He understood the value of Manchuria. He was fully on board with the military plans to eventually seize control over it. Japan had been planning to do so ever since, before the Russo-Japanese War. But they wanted to take their time. It was these radicals who were accelerating things far too quickly for everyone's liking. He turned a blind eye. He dished light punishments and he carried on. However, the local conflict escalated. It traveled to Shanghai by 1932, and here Hirohito did take action. He understood Shanghai was full of Western powers. Nations like Britain and America could place economic sanctions on Japan if things were allowed to get out of hand over here. So he ordered General Yoshinori Shirakawa to bring the Shanghai expedition to a close. During this period, two factions had emerged within the Japanese military, the Kodaha, or imperial way, and the Tosaha, or control, faction. The Kodaha faction was founded by General Sadio Araki and his protege, Jinzaburo Masaki. Their primary objective was a Showa restoration, aimed at purging Japan of corrupt politicians and businessmen, especially those associated with the nasty Zaibatsu. Composed mainly of young army officers, the Koda espoused a romanticized and radical interpretation of Bushido, or honestly I'd call it a bastardized version of Bushido, idealizing pre-industrial Japan, with Araki believing that everything had been tainted by the Western influence. To achieve their goals, they resorted to assassinations and a planned coup d'etat. In response, the Tosaha faction was formed, initially led by Lieutenant General Tetsuza Nagata, and then later by Hideki Tojo. Nearly identical to the Kodaha, the Tosaha sought a Showa restoration as well, but they adopted a more moderate and conservative approach. They recognized the importance of preserving traditional values while integrating Western ideals, advocating for a balanced perspective. The Tosaha promoted pragmatic military strategies to navigate the complexities of modern warfare. Although they acknowledged the existence of corrupt politicians and, especially the Zaibatsu, they preferred to work within the existing political system, anticipating that future total wars would necessitate strengthened industrial military capacity. Their ranks primarily included promising graduates from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, Army Staff College, and select naval members. The most significant distinction between the two factions was the Tosa explicitly rejected the use of a coup d'etat to pursue their goals. Now, between 1932 and 1936, radical officers, mostly of the Koda faction, assassinated numerous politicians and military leaders trying to usher in a Showa restoration. You might be led to believe that this was in the interest of Hirohito, and you would be mistaken. Hirohito absolutely did not want a military dictatorship at the whim of the cult of the emperor. It's ironic to say, given how World War II turns out, but you have to see, this would have really been a hostage situation. Hirohito wanted to maintain the exact ambiguous situation that was Showa-era Japan pre-1945. It was really working to his benefit. It was ideal for him because it defended the Kokutai, and he couldn't be personally blamed for everything that was going on. Think of it this way, it's like he got his cake and got to eat it as well. He was making most of the decisions, but everything was being placed on the shoulders of his military. If things were to go very wrong, you could always say it was the military that did everything. And that's exactly what he did. The February 26 incident of 1936 was the climax of the Koda faction. For those who don't know, you can actually go over to my YouTube channel, or I believe I do have an exclusive podcast on the subject. Just check out the February 26 incident. But short summary, the Koda faction performed a mutiny trying to usher in a Showa restoration. They assumed when their messenger came to the emperor, he would simply join them and take direct rule. He did not. He was really pissed. His first thought was the mutineers were trying to actually enlist his brother, Chichibu, to overthrow him. He dragged his brother over, and he had a firm talking with him. His brother was actually fraternizing with a lot of Koda members, so there was something to this. Anyways, in a meeting, he demanded that he stopped associating with these radicals, and that he promised to never challenge him. Then Hirohito furiously demanded the mutineers be dealt with. At one point, he even threatened to lead the Imperial Guards personally to put them down. The coup failed. The Koda faction was completely destroyed. Ironically, the Tosa faction were the ones who did it to them, and they became the de facto ruling clique. The military, especially the Kwangtung Army, did not stop with their insubordination, though. As we saw, they invaded Manchuria, then they set their sights on North China and Inner Mongolia. I'm actually finishing up a 4-part series on just that over on my YouTube channel. These same episodes, I first began work with my new animators, so I would love and appreciate it if you guys checked it out and leave a comment saying that you came from over here. But anyways, after that, which ends about 1936, on July the 8th of 1937, the Kwangtung Army performed another false flag operation, this time at the Marco Polo Bridge. And this ushered in, officially, the Second Sino-Japanese War. Unofficially, you could argue it started in 1931. Certainly, if you ask the Chinese, it was a 15-year war. And this was one of many false flag operations that they had pulled off over the years. Upon being told about this, Hirohito's first response was whether the USSR would invade Manchukuo over the matter. This is what he said to Prime Minister Kokutai at the time and Army Minister Sugiyama. "What will you do if the Soviets attack us from the rear?" Prince Kenin answered this: "I believe the army will rise to the occasion." The emperor repeated his question. "That's no more than army dogma. What will you actually do in the unlikely event that the Soviet forces attack?" The prince replied, "We will have no choice." The emperor seemed very dissatisfied with this answer. Hirohito was furious. He demanded to know what contingency plans existed, and countless advisors began explaining to him what they would do, and eventually he gave the red seal of approval to invade northern China. Henceforth, he micromanaged a lot of the military decisions going forward, and he oversaw the forming and dissolving of numerous cabinets and positions when things were not going his way or when they were. Emperor Hirohito was presented with several opportunities to cause ceasefires or peace settlements during the war years. One of the best possible moments came after the attack on Nanjing, when Chiang Kai-shek's military was in utter disarray. On July the 11th of 1938, the commander of the 19th Division fought a border clash with the USSR, known in the West as the Battle of Lake Khasan. It was a very costly defeat for Japan, and in the diary of one Harada Kumeo, he noted Hirohito scolded Army Minister Itagaki at the time. "Hereafter, not a single soldier is to be moved without my permission." When it looked like the USSR would not press for a counterattack across the border, Hirohito finally gave the order for offensives in China to recommence. Again, an example of him deciding when to lay down the hammer. By 1939, the United States began threatening sanctions against Japan for what she was doing in China. Hirohito complained to his chief aide-de-camp, Hata Shinroku, on August 5th. "It could be a great blow to scrap metal and oil." Hirohito was livid, and he scolded many of his top officials and forced the appointment of General Abe to prime minister, and he demanded of him to cooperate with the United States and Britain and preserve internal order. Now, as we fast forward a bit, with war raging in Europe, on June the 19th of 1940, Hirohito asked his chief of staff, Prince Kenin, and the army minister at the time, Hata, "At a time when peace will soon come, the Europe situation, will there be a deployment of troops to the Netherlands Indies and French Indochina?" This question highlighted Hirohito's belief at that time that Germany was close to achieving victory, which led him gradually to consider deploying troops to French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies, since those parent nations couldn't possibly defend their territories and especially those vital resources. Regarding the war in China, the Japanese aimed to stop the flow of materials entering China from places like Hong Kong. Hirohito received reports indicating that Britain would not agree to block the shipment of materials into China via Hong Kong, and the military recognized that an invasion of Hong Kong might be necessary, which would mean declaring war on Britain. When this was explained to him, Hirohito responded, "If that occurs, I'm sure America will enforce an embargo. Don't you think so?" In response, his aide Kido, the Lord of the Privy Seal at the time, reassured him by stating, "The nation must be fully prepared to resist, proceeding with caution and avoiding being drawn into events instigated by foreign interests." Hirohito went through countless meetings, but eventually he would sign Order Number 458, authorizing the invasion of French Indochina, knowing full well the consequences. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands all began embargoes upon Japan of oil, rubber, and iron, all the things needed for the military. In the words of Admiral Takagi, "As time passes and this situation continues, our empire will either be totally defeated or forced to fight a hopeless war. Therefore, we should pursue war and diplomacy together. If there is no prospect of securing our final line of national survival by diplomatic negotiations, we must be resolved to fight." Hirohito understood the predicament full well. Each day, Japan was wasting more of its oil reserves, and if they were to strike, it had to be quickly. On October the 13th of that year, Hirohito told his closest advisor, Koichi Kido, "In the present situation, there seems to be little hope for Japan-US negotiations. If hostilities erupt this time, I think I may have to issue a declaration of war." Now, the reason why I'm jumping all over the place and bringing all this stuff up is to just solidify that Hirohito had agency. He was micromanaging and forming very big decisions here. After the war broke out with the West, Hirohito did have the ability to stamp his foot down. Of course, there could have been wild repercussions. His military could have usurped him, and maybe tossed Chichibu in the throne. It was possible. But you need to keep this mindset. As far as to why Hirohito acts or doesn't act, it was always to protect the Kokutai. Thus, one of the great levers of peace solely rested on Hirohito's perception if the Kokutai could be retained or not. From the outset of the Pacific War, Hirohito believed Germany was going to defeat the USSR. In line with his military leaders, they all believed Japan had to seize everything that they could in the Asia-Pacific and thwart off the United States until a negotiated peace could be met. Hirohito committed himself to overseeing the war, determined to achieve victory at all cost. He was a very cautious leader. He meticulously analyzed each campaign, anticipated potential setbacks, and crafted worst-case scenarios. He maintained a skeptical view of all of the reports from his senior officials, and he was very harshly critical of high commanders. While he did not frequently visit the front lines like some kind of general, Hirohito wielded significant influence over theater operations, shaping both planning and execution whenever he deemed it necessary. Similar to his approach during the war in China, he issued the highest military orders from the imperial headquarters, where he conducted audited conferences and made decisions communicated under his official name. He regularly welcomed generals and admirals to the imperial palace for detailed briefings on the battlefront and visited various military bases, battleships, and army and naval headquarters. His inspections encompassed military schools and other significant military institutions, adding to his comprehensive involvement in the war effort. Now, the war went extremely well for Japan until the Battle of Midway and Guadalcanal. Midway was a major setback, but Japan retained the initiative. Then the Guadalcanal campaign saw Japan lose said initiative to the Americans. Upon receiving the initial report of the Ichigi detachment's annihilation, Hirohito remarked, "I am sure Guadalcanal can be held." Despite the numerous reports detailing the devastating effects of tropical diseases and starvation upon his troops, he persistently demanded greater efforts from them. Hirohito exerted continuous pressure on his naval and land commanders to retake the island. On September the 15th, November the 5th, and November the 11th, he requested additional Imperial Japanese Army troops and aircraft be allocated specifically to the cause. General Sugiyama expressed concerns about dispatching more pilots due to their inexperience in transoceanic combat, preferring to reinforce the North China Army for an attack on Chongqing instead. Hirohito pressed the issue again, but Sugiyama responded that the army had diverted its air resources to New Guinea and Rabaul. Undeterred by the objections from his senior commanders, Hirohito persisted in his demands. By late November, it became evident that Guadalcanal was a lost cause, however. At the Imperial Headquarters Conference on December 31st of 1942, the Chiefs of Staff proposed canceling the attempts to recapture Guadalcanal. Hirohito sanctioned this decision, but stated, "It is unacceptable to just give up on capturing Guadalcanal. We must launch an offensive elsewhere." He insisted on this point, leading to a selection of new strategic targets in the Solomon Islands, north of New Georgia, and in the Stanley Range on New Guinea. Hirohito even threatened to withhold authorization for withdrawing troops from Guadalcanal until a new plan was established. He later opposed the withdrawal from Munda Airfield, as it contradicted the newly defined defensive line at the time. As the defensive perimeter in the central and northern Solomons began to crumble, Hirohito continued to insist that the Navy engage in a decisive battle to regain the initiative, allowing for the transport of supplies to many soldiers trapped on various islands. When he learned of the Navy's failure to reinforce Leh on March the 3rd, he asked, "Then why didn't you change plans immediately and land on Medan? This is a failure, but it can teach us a good lesson and become a source of future success. Do this for me, so I can have peace of mind for a while." This phrase, "do this for me," would come to be kind of a signature of him. After Guadalcanal, it was loss after loss for Japan. By February of 1944, Hirohito forced Sugiyama to resign so Hideki Tojo could take his position, even though Tojo at this point was already prime minister and the army minister. Hirohito worked very closely with Tojo to plan some last-ditch efforts to change the war situation. I think the most significant one was Operation Ichigo. As much damage as they did to China with that, Chiang Kai-shek's government survived. It did not turn out to be the knockout blow. Hirohito watched as island by island fell to the Americans. When the Americans were poised to take Saipan, he warned Tojo, "If we ever lose Saipan, repeated air attacks on Tokyo will follow. No matter what it takes, we must hold there." Saipan fell, so Hirohito stopped supporting Tojo, and he allowed his rivals to take down his cabinet, which happened by June 18th of 1944. Hirohito remained resolute in his determination to wrest victory from the Allies. On October the 18th, the Imperial headquarters ordered a decisive naval engagement, which led directly to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. After the war, Hirohito publicly stated, "Contrary to the views of the Army and Navy General Staffs, I consented to the showdown battle at Leyte, believing that if we launched an attack and the Americans hesitated, we might finally find an opportunity to negotiate." Leyte Gulf didn't work. The military then began the kamikaze programs. On New Year's Day of 1945, Hirohito inspected the special last meal rations given to departing kamikaze units. Again, he was always very involved. Iwo Jima fell. Okinawa remained, and Hirohito lashed out. "Is it because we failed to sink enemy transports that we've let the enemy get ashore? Isn't there any way to defend Okinawa from the landing enemy forces?" On the second day of Okinawa's invasion, Hirohito ordered a counter-landing by the 32nd Army and urged the Navy to counterattack in every way possible. He kept pushing and pushing and pushing for more to be done against Okinawa. It was a horrible failure. It cost the lives of up to 120,000 Japanese combatants, 170,000 non-combatants, many of which were Okinawan civilians. The Americans lost nearly 13,000 killed, 33,000 wounded. It was a bloodbath, the worst battle of the Pacific War. Now, around this period comes the time when Japan seriously began looking for ways to surrender. In Europe, Germany was heading to defeat, and the Japanese knew this. As for Japan, their army in Burma had been annihilated. Their forces in China were faring better after Operation Ichigo. It did open up a land corridor amongst the main railway from Beiping to Wuhan and throughout Guangdong province, but they were still deadlocked in a stalemate, facing a guerrilla war that was costing them about 64% of their entire military expenditures. All the while, they deeply feared once the Soviets finished up with the Germans, they would undoubtedly turn against them at Manchuria. With the Soviets attacking from the north, they thought the United States would definitely attack them from the south. Many of the Japanese actually believed they would land in a place like Shanghai, or the home islands, of course. The kamikaze tactics were proving formidable, but they were not nearly enough. By 1945, 43% of the Imperial Japanese Army were now stationed in the Japanese home islands, Korea, and Formosa. They were bracing for the final stand. Former Prime Minister Rijiro Wakatsuki came out of retirement in May of 1945, having heard that Germany collapsed, and he came to urge Hirohito and then Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki to open negotiations with the Americans as soon as possible. However, he also said this: "The enemy must first be made to see the disadvantages of continuing the war." To this point, Hirohito's chief counselor, Makino Nobuyaki, said that the ultimate priority is to develop an advantageous war situation. Other advisor, Admiral Keisuke Okada, said, "Japan should wait for a moment favorable for us, then make peace." Other advisors like Kichiro Hiranuma and Koiki Hirota advised the emperor that they should fight to the death. Now I want to bring a key player into the surrender decision, that of Prince Konoe. Konoe was very close to Hirohito, and he understood the emperor's mentality, especially how he viewed things in relation to the Kokutai. The senior statesman had been consulting with Hirohito for over 18 months at this point, trying to convey the message that if the war continued, it would threaten the Kokutai. Many months prior, he confided in the emperor's brother, Prince Takematsu, that the army was suffering from a cancer in the form of the Tosaha faction. However, he noted that Kido and others did not share his perspective, while His Majesty is relatively unconcerned with ideological issues. For the past 4 years, it seemed the emperor had been advised and still believed that the true extremists were the Kokutai faction, who were honestly not really a relevant thing anymore. In reality, the greater threat to the Kokutai arose from the Tosa faction. Kokutai further asserted that if the war escalated, they would attempt to alter the Kokutai. Kokutai speculated that whether the threat originated from communists within the nation, primarily referring to left-wing radicals in the Tosa faction, or from the Anglo-American enemy, both would seek to preserve the emperor while pushing towards the country's communization. In his written report to the emperor, dated February 14th of that year, which Kido listened to attentively, Kokutai elaborated on his supposed conspiracy theory. He asserted that the Soviet Union regarded Japan as its primary threat in East Asia. The Soviets had allied with the Chinese Communists, the largest, most formidable communist party in Asia, and they were collaborating with the United States and Britain to drive Japan out of China. He warned that they would enter the war when the opportunity arose. Defeat, he cautioned the emperor, was inevitable if the conflict persisted. However, he emphasized that a far greater fear was the potential destruction of the Kokutai. The ongoing war was eroding the domestic status quo, unleashing forces that threatened Japan and its imperial institution from within as much as from external adversaries. The real danger lay in the emperor's and Kido's trust in the generals of the Tosa faction, who were unintentionally facilitating the communization of Japan. Kokutai implored for a swift peace settlement before a communist revolution emerged, making the preservation of the Kokutai impossible. Hirohito agreed with Kokutai, but also stated, "To end the war would be very difficult unless we make one more military gain." Kokutai allegedly replied this, "Is that possible? It must happen soon. If we have to wait much longer, a mere battle victory will mean nothing." To this the emperor replied, "If we hold out long enough in this war, we may be able to win. But what worries me is whether the nation will be able to endure it until then." On February the 15th of 1945, Hirohito's intelligence warned the Soviet Union would likely abrogate its neutrality pact with Japan. Back then, even Tojo conceded there was a 50-50% chance the USSR would just invade Manchuria. In March, the US began B-29 incendiary bombing raids over Tokyo, turning 40% of the capital into ash. On March 18th, Hirohito with some aides drove around the capital to witness the devastation firsthand. To them, the civilians looked exhausted and bewildered. Hirohito was told factory production was collapsing. Absenteeism was rising. Instances of lèse-majesté were running rampant. For the next 5 months, imperial family members and senior statesmen all began speaking to Hirohito about the crisis of the Kokutai. The threat Kokutai had warned about months prior was becoming the main talking point. It seemed like the Japanese people within the countryside and the urban areas remained steadfast in their resolve to obey their leaders, work and sacrifice for their nation. But for how long would they feel so? It was only after the battle for Okinawa was lost and 60 Japanese cities had been leveled to the ground by incendiary bombs that Hirohito openly indicated that he wanted to negotiate a surrender. Kido's diary reveals the first clear indication that the emperor might be urged to consider an early peace on June 8th of 1945, when Kido drafted his draft plan for controlling the crisis situation. This marked a pivotal moment. It followed the unintentional bombing of the imperial palace, a complete loss of hope for saving Okinawa, and coincided with the day the Supreme War Leadership Council adopted the basic policy for the future direction of the war. With fighting in Europe concluded, Japan found itself entirely isolated. Kido's plan, although quite vague, proposed seeking the Soviet Union's assistance as an intermediary to help Japan gain leverage in negotiations with its adversaries. By drafting this plan, Kido signaled the end of his long alliance with military hardliners. Hirohito's acceptance of this indicated his readiness for an early peace. Hirohito was moved to an underground bunker in the mountains of Matsushiro in Nagano Prefecture, whereupon those around him noted he fell into a deep depression. On June the 22nd, Hirohito informed the Supreme War Leadership Council he wanted them to open diplomatic maneuvers to end the war. In early July, Soviet ambassador Yakov Malik broke off inconclusive talks with Hirota. Hirohito stepped in immediately and ordered a new special envoy to be sent to Moscow. However, Hirohito nor the Suzuki government had any concrete plans on how to mediate a surrender through the Soviets. The only things they did prioritize was a guarantee of the emperor's political position and retainment of the imperial system, i.e., the Kokutai. This was taken into consideration rather than ending the war as quickly as possible to save countless, if not millions, of lives. From April the 8th of 1945 until Japan's capitulation, the Suzuki government's chief war policy was Ketsugo, an advanced iteration of Josengo, or Victory Number 3, which was a plan to defend the home islands. The hallmark of this strategy was heavy reliance on suicidal tactics, including the deploying of massive numbers of kamikaze special attack planes, human torpedoes launched from submarines, dynamite-stuffed crash boats powered by truck engines, human rocket bombs carried by aircraft, and suicidal assaults by specially trained ground units. Oh, and of course there was the famous Fukuru kamikaze frogmen. I happen to have an episode coming out on YouTube probably around this time on that. As silly as that sounds, it was really dark point of history. It's an interesting part of history, we'll say that much. While preparations for Operation Ketsugo progressed, the Imperial Diet convened on June the 9th to pass a wartime emergency measures law, along with 5 additional measures aimed at mobilizing the entire nation for the final battle. On that same day, the emperor, who had yet to initiate efforts to end the war, issued another imperial rescript in conjunction with the Diet's convocation, instructing the nation to, quote, "smash the inordinate ambitions of the enemy nations and achieve the goals of the war." Concurrently, the controlled press launched a daily Die for the Emperor campaign to foster gratitude for the imperial benevolence and, from around mid-July onwards, initiate a campaign to protect the Kokutai. The Americans countered with their own propaganda, aimed at breaking Japan's will to fight. B-29 bombers dropped millions of leaflets written in Japanese, announcing the next scheduled targets for bombing raids and urging surrender, while using the emperor to challenge the militarists. Leaflets bearing the imperial crest criticized the military cliques for forcing the entire nation to commit suicide, and called on everyone to exercise their constitutional rights to make direct appeals for peace to the emperor. They asserted that even the powerful military cliques cannot stop the mighty march for peace of the emperor and the people. One notable batch of 7 million leaflets conveyed the terms of the joint declaration issued by the United States, Great Britain, and China. "Today we come not to bomb you. We are dropping this leaflet to inform you of the response from the United States government to your government's request for conditions of surrender. Whether the war stops immediately depends on your government. You will understand how to end the war if you read these 2 official notifications." Amidst pressures from the imperial edicts to continue preparations for the final battle and focus solely on victory, the Japanese people were also subjected to quite an intense American psychological warfare campaign, in addition to aerial bombardment. During late July and August, prefectural governors, police chiefs, and officers of the Special Hire Police submitted reports to the Home Ministry detailing the rapidly deteriorating national morale. What that basically means is the Japanese people were rising up against them. Now on the other side, Roosevelt had made it known back in January of 1943 at the Casablanca Conference the Allies would only accept unconditional surrender. By 1945, the Allies understood the predicament that this left Japan in. On May the 8th of 1945, Truman added, "Japan's surrender would not mean the extermination or enslavement of the Japanese people," basically trying to indicate a non-vindictive spirit. However, the Kokutai question always remained ambiguous. Of the State Department, Joseph Grew, and also a former ambassador to Japan, began arguing to Truman they needed to make it public, a clear definition of the terms to persuade Japan to surrender. As he argued to Truman, Emperor Hirohito was seen as the key figure in Japan's surrender, likened to a queen bee in a hive, surrounded by the attentions of the hive. Throughout the war, he was characterized in various ways as a puppet of the militarists, a constitutional monarch, and a pacifist. Grew had immense faith in the influence exerted by what he referred to as the moderates surrounding the Japanese throne. However, many of Grew's colleagues argued the future existence of the Japanese monarchy was intolerable, as they saw it basically as fascism. Many wanted to punish the emperor. Truman was in a bit of a tug of war. The Potsdam Declaration issued on July 26 of 1945 came in the form of an ultimatum aimed to quicken Japan's surrender. Truman clarified the terms for the unconditional surrender at the end of it. We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces, and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. Zero mention of the emperor. Grew had argued to add this segment. This may include a constitutional monarchy under the present dynasty. But this was deleted from the article. The status of the emperor was not guaranteed. The Kokutai was thus up in the air. The next day, the Suzuki cabinet rejected the terms. The Japanese leadership and Emperor Hirohito were still banking and awaiting Soviet replies to their terms. Let's talk a little bit about the Soviet talks. Back on July the 12th, Ambassador Nataki Seto sent this message to the Soviets. His Majesty the Emperor, mindful of the fact that the present war daily brings greater evil and sacrifice upon the peoples of all the belligerent powers, desires from his heart that it may be quickly terminated. But so long as England and the United States insist upon unconditional surrender, the Japanese Empire has no alternative but to fight on with all of its strength for the honor and existence of the motherland. The problem with talking to the Soviets was the Soviets had made commitments to their allies. No separate pieces, and the Soviets even promised Truman they were going to invade Japan. For the Soviets, their primary objective was to ensure unrestricted access to the Pacific Ocean. The year-round ice-free areas of the Soviet Pacific coastline, particularly that of Vladivostok, could be blockaded by air and sea from Sakhalin Island or the Kuril Islands. Securing these territories to guarantee free access to the Soya Strait was their main goal. Secondary objectives included acquiring leases for the Chinese Eastern Railway, the Southern Manchurian Railway, as well as gaining control over Dairen and Port Arthur. If it sounds like the Russo-Japanese War 2.0, and that's exactly what it was. To achieve these aims, Stalin and Molotov prolonged negotiations with the Japanese, creating a false sense of hope for a Soviet-mediated peace. Simultaneously, in their discussions with the United States and Britain, the Soviets insisted on strict adherence to the Cairo Declaration, which had been reaffirmed during the Yalta Conference. This declaration stipulated that the Allies would not accept a separate surrender or any conditional peace with Japan, thus the Japanese would need to surrender unconditionally to all of the Allies. The Soviets aimed to prolong the war by opposing any efforts to dilute this requirement. This approach would provide the Soviets with the necessary time to complete the transfer of their troops from the Western Front to the Far East and to conquer Manchuria, Inner Mongolia, Northern Korea, Sakhalin, and the Kurils, and potentially Hokkaido, starting with the assault on Urumoy. Here we come to August of 1945, the critical point, we'll call it. The Americans prepared for the deployment of atomic bombs and for the invasion of southern Kyushu, known as Operation Olympic, scheduled to commence November the 1st. At 8:15 a.m. on August the 6th, a single B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped the Little Boy, devastating much of the undefended city of Hiroshima, instantly killing an estimated 100 to 140,000 people, and leading to the deaths of a possible other 100,000 people over the next 5 years. At the epicenter of the explosion, a light appeared 3,000 times brighter than the sun, creating a fireball that emitted thermal radiation capable of instantly scorching humans, trees, and houses. As the air heated and rushed upward, cold air surged to ignite a firestorm. Hours later, a whirlwind escalated the flames to their peak until more than 8 square miles were virtually reduced to cinder. Subsequently, black, muddy rain filled with radioactive fallout began to fall. 2 days later, upon Japan's rejection of the Potsdam Declaration as a pretext, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. It was just after midnight on August 8th. Then on August 9th, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, resulting in the immediate deaths of approximately about 40,000 people, injuring another 60,000. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, during this critical period between the Potsdam Declaration and the atomic bombs and invasion, Emperor Hirohito remained silent about accepting the Potsdam terms. However, on July 25th and 31st, he explicitly conveyed to Kido that the imperial regalia must be defended at all costs. These were three sacred objects, a mirror, a curved jewel, and a sword, that symbolized the legitimacy of his rule through the northern court and were integral to his identity as the divine sovereign. Hirohito's focus was on protecting these symbols of office, as he insisted on having them brought to the palace. This fixation on maintaining his symbols occurred during quite a pivotal moment, when the pressing issue was whether to accept immediate capitulation. Reflecting on this, he was unprepared to seize the opportunity to end the war himself, it seems. Prime Minister Suzuki, following his initial rejection of the Potsdam Ultimatum, was also seeing no need for further action. His Cabinet Advisory Council, which included the president of Asano Cement, the founder of the Nissan Consortium, the vice president of the Bank of Japan, and other representatives of the nation's leading business interests, who had all profited significantly from the war, by the way, conveyed on the morning of August the 3rd. They recommended accepting the Potsdam terms, arguing that the United States would permit Japan to retain its non-military industries and continue participating in world trade. Now, I want to go through some of the reactions to the two bombs and the invasion of Manchuria. Yonai Mitsumasa said to Admiral Takagi Sokichi on August the 12th, "I think the terms is perhaps inappropriate, but the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry into the war are, in a sense, gifts from the gods, tenyu, also heaven-sent blessings. This way we don't have to say that we quit the war because of domestic circumstances. I've long been advocating for control over this crisis, but neither from fear of an enemy attack nor because of the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry into the war. The main reason is my anxiety over the domestic situation. So it is rather fortunate that we can now control matters without revealing the domestic situation." I find this quote very revealing to some of the mentality going on and some of the reality, because, again, some of you older audience members would have been told this narrative that if Operation Downfall was to have happened, every single Japanese man, woman, and child would have fought to the death. But would they? Really? A population that had already undergone Operation Starvation, i.e., they were starving to death. How is said population going to be able to fight if they're starving to death? Sure, I think the majority would fight, initially. Then they would turn on their own government. In fact, I think before the invasion, they would have started. Now, Konoi's characterization of the Soviet involvement in the war was as such. It was a godsend for controlling the army. Kido viewed both the atomic bombings and the Soviet entry into the conflict as useful elements for ensuring a smooth transition. And his power struggle was unfolding, rendering the potential death toll, whether 100,000 or 200,000, immaterial to those involved, as long as their desired outcome was achieved, an end to the war that would leave the monarchy intact and capable of managing the discontent that defeat would inevitably provoke. Throughout the final acts of this wartime drama, the Japanese moderates found it easier to capitulate to external pressures than to take decisive action on their own to conclude the war. Another illuminating look at Japan's elite perspective on surrender terms was the document titled Essentials of Peace Negotiations, drafted by Konoi and his advisor, retired Lieutenant General Sekai Koji. After Konoi had reluctantly accepted a mission to Moscow, this document stipulated the preservation of the emperor system, along with most of the imperial prerogatives, as the absolute minimum condition for peace. It defined the original or essential homeland as including the southern half of the Kuril Islands, but showed a willingness to concede all overseas territories to the enemy, including Okinawa and the American-occupied Bonin Islands, as well as the southern half of Sakhalin. The Essentials also accepted complete disarmament for an unspecified period, thereby compromising on the issues of demobilization and disarming the armed forces. More significantly, an explanation attached to the Essentials emphasized that, quote, "The main aim is to secure the imperial line and maintain the political role of the emperor." So after a rather long podcast by this point, again I come back to the question, why did Japan ultimately surrender? The twin psychological shocks of the first atomic bomb and the Soviet entry into the war, combined with Kido and the emperor's concerns over escalating public criticism of the throne and its occupant, fueled an almost paranoid fear that sooner or later the populace would react violently against their leaders if the war persisted any longer. These factors ultimately led Hirohito to accept in principle the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. At the first meeting of the six-member Supreme War Leadership Council, held from 10:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. on August the 9th, Army Minister Anami Korichika, Chiefs of Staff Umezu Yoshijiro, representing the Army, and Yonai, representing the Navy, along with Togo from the Foreign Ministry, were expected to discuss the acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. Instead, the conversation revolved around whether to attempt a conditional surrender, specifically, should they insist on one condition, the preservation of the Kokutai, or all four. After Suzuki addressed the assembly regarding the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and the Soviet attack, Yonai, as recounted by Navy Chief of Staff Toyoda, was the first to speak, framing the issue in terms of the four conditions. Let's start the talk. Do we accept the Potsdam Declaration with no conditions? If not, and we wish to insist on attaching hopes and conditions, we may do so this way. First, preservation of the Kokutai. Then, for the rest, the main items in the Potsdam Declaration, treatment of war criminals, method of disarmament, and the matter of sending in an army of occupation. Thus, the participants identified what they perceived to be the ambiguous points within the Potsdam Declaration, and they used them as the foundation for their discussions. The Army insisted on all four of the conditions. First, the preservation of the Kokutai, which they considered distinct from the Potsdam Declaration itself. The other conditions proposed were second, and the Imperial headquarters assumed responsibility for disarmament and demobilization. Third, a prohibition on occupation. And fourth, the delegation of the punishment of war criminals to the Japanese government. The Army equated the Kokutai with the Emperor's right of supreme command. Their self-serving desire for autonomous war crimes trials was based on the belief that the Allies would use such trials to politically indict the military. Consequently, Army leaders aimed to preempt the activities of any international tribunal by conducting their own trials, basically what the Germans tried to do after World War I. Supporting the military's views during the cabinet meetings that day were the three civilian members of the Suzuki cabinet: Justice Minister Matsuzaka Hiromasa, Home Minister Tazue Toji, and the Minister of Health Okada Tadehiko. At the Imperial Conference that night, which extended into the early hours of the 10th, Foreign Minister Togo's interpretation of the preservation of the Kokutai referred solely to the safeguarding of the imperial house or dynasty, rather than the continuation of Hirohito's reign. Hiranuma, another advocate for the single condition, interpreted the Kokutai as the emperor's sovereign right to rule the state not deriving from national law. Even if the entire nation is sacrificed to the war, we must preserve both the Kokutai and the security of the imperial house. This discrepancy illustrated that there was no completely unified understanding of what exactly the Kokutai entailed. The debate over one condition versus four represented conflicting visions for the future of the Japanese state, and masked the competition for political power that was already unfolding. It remains doubtful whether the Emperor and Kido initially sided with Togo against the four conditions proposed by the senior military leaders. A more likely inference is that both men retained sympathies for the hardliners, both military and civilian, who preferred to continue the futile war rather than surrender immediately and unconditionally. This may explain why on August the 9th, Konoe had Hosokawa Morisada approach the Navy General Headquarters to urge the Emperor's brother, Prince Takematsu, to pressure Hirohito, through Kido, to accept the Potsdam terms. Later that afternoon, Konoe enlisted the help of diplomat Shigemitsu Mamoru to persuade Kido to reconsider his stance on the four conditions. Ultimately, at the urging of Takematsu and Shigemitsu, Kido did not shift to support Togo's position. At the end of the war, as at its beginning and throughout every stage of its progression, Emperor Hirohito played a highly active role in supporting the actions carried out in his name. From the very beginning of the Asia-Pacific War, the Emperor played a significant role in the unfolding events around him. Prior to the Battle of Okinawa, he consistently advocated for a decisive victory. Afterwards, he acknowledged the necessity of pursuing an early peace, although he did not favor an immediate cessation of hostilities. Instead, he wavered, steering Japan towards ongoing warfare rather than direct negotiations with the Allies. When the final crisis finally unfolded, the only option left was unconditional surrender. Even then, he continued to procrastinate until the atomic bomb was dropped and the Soviets launched their attack. The wartime emperor ideology that once sustained morale made it exceedingly difficult for Japan's leaders to accept the act of surrender. Aware of their objective defeat, yet indifferent to the suffering the war inflicted on their own people, as well as the populations of Asia for that matter, the Pacific and the West whose lives they had really disrupted, the emperor and his military leaders sought a means to lose without appearing to lose. They aimed to mitigate domestic criticism following surrender while preserving their power structure. Blinded by their fixation on the fate of the imperial house and committed to an overly optimistic diplomacy towards the Soviet Union, Japan's leaders missed several opportunities to end their lost war. Would Japan's leaders have surrendered more promptly if the Truman administration had clarified the status of the emperor before the double shock of the atomic bombs were dropped and the Soviet entry into the war? Probably not. However, it is likely they would have surrendered to prevent the Kokutai from being destroyed from within. The evidence suggests that the first atomic bomb and the Soviet declaration of war, led by Hirohito, Kido, and the other members of the court, to believe that continuing the war would inevitably result in that destruction. They recognized that the populace was war-weary and despondent, with rising hostility towards the military and government, accompanied by increasing criticism of the emperor himself. Yeah, that one actually really scared Hirohito. More specifically, Kido and Hirohito were privy to the Home Ministry reports, which contain information from governors and police chiefs nationwide. These reports indicated that citizens were beginning to label the emperor as an incompetent leader, responsible for the deteriorating war situation. And there, folks, is the third variable, never really spoken about. Many first look at the atomic bombs. The bigger brain people look at the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. But hardly anybody ever talks about the collapse of Japan's social fabric. Something that scared the shit out of Emperor Hirohito and his closest advisors. One cannot have the Kokutai without the populace to hold it up. When the emperor expressed in February, "What worries me is whether the nation could endure long enough to achieve victory," he was not merely voicing concerns for the suffering of his subjects. Rather, he feared that such suffering could lead to social upheaval. In short, a revolution. At that time, he referred to the ordinary war-related hardships of food shortages, air raids, devastated cities, destruction of homes, and the omnipresent grief from the loss of loved ones. The atomic bombs escalated death, pain, and suffering to unimaginable higher levels, intensifying the threat from within. After the bombings of Japan and the 2 atomic bombs, Hirohito was, in a dark way, given a golden get-out-of-jail-free card, if you think about it. Hirohito could now save his suffering people from further anguish by surrendering, allowing him to deflect responsibility for leading them into misery, while adopting an air of benevolence and care. And indeed, Hirohito did just that, though not primarily for the Japanese people, but rather for the survival of his own imperial house and his throne. After the bombing of Hiroshima, Hirohito delayed for a full 2 days before instructing Kido, shortly before 10 a.m. on August 9th, to, quote, "quickly control the situation, because the Soviet Union had declared war." Kido immediately communicated with Prime Minister Suzuki, who began arrangements for an imperial conference scheduled later that night. Following the conference on August 10th, Chief Cabinet Secretary Sekimizu took charge of drafting the imperial rescript ending the war, based on Hirohito's directives. Assisted by 2 scholars of the Chinese classics, Kawada Mizuho and Yosuoka Masahiro, Sakomizo worked tirelessly for over 3 days before submitting a version of the rescript to the Suzuki cabinet. After 6 hours of contentious discussions on the night of August 14th, the cabinet modified and approved the document. Hirohito promptly signed it, and Shimamura and Kido persuaded him to record a suitably opaque final version for broadcast to the nation. On the night of August 14th, the Suzuki government notified the United States and the other allied nations that it had accepted both the Potsdam Declaration and the Burns Letter of August 11th. Accelerating the emperor's actions during this climactic moment of the unconditional surrender drama was the American psychological warfare campaign. When a leaflet dropped from B-29 bombers came into Kido's possession on the night of August 13th, or on the morning of the 14th, he conferred with the emperor and explained the gravity of the situation. The latest enemy leaflets were informing the Japanese people of their government's notification of surrender under one condition, along with the full text of Bryan's response. If this continued, it would undermine the imperial government's reliance on secrecy to obscure the true nature of the lost war and the reasons for the prolonged surrender delay. Given Kido and the emperor's concerns about rising signs of defeatism, including criticism of the throne, immediate action was necessary to prevent the populace from acting out on their own initiative. Thus, a hasty second meeting was convened, and at noon on August 15th, the Japanese people gathered around their radio receivers as they heard, most for the first time, a very high-pitched voice of their emperor, and he said this: "After pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire today, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. We have ordered our government to communicate to the governments of the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union that our empire accepts the provisions of their joint declaration. To strive for the common prosperity and the happiness of all nations, as well as the security and well-being of our subjects, is the solemn obligation which has been handed down by our imperial ancestors and which lies close to our heart. Indeed, we declared war on America and Britain out of our sincere desire to ensure Japan's self-preservation and the stabilization of East Asia, it being far from our thought to either infringe upon the sovereignty of other nations or to embark upon territorial aggrandizement. But now the war has lasted for nearly 4 years. Despite the best that has been done by everyone, the gallant fighting of our military and naval forces, the diligence and assiduity of our servants of the state, and the devoted service of our 100 million people, the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. Such being the case, how are we to save the millions of our subjects, or to atone ourselves before the hallowed spirits of our imperial ancestors? This is the reason why we have ordered the acceptance of the provisions of the Joint Declaration of the Powers. The hardships and sufferings to which our nation is to be subjected thereafter will be certainly great. We are keenly aware of the inmost feelings of all of you, our subjects. However, it is according to the dictates of time and fate that we have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all of the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is unsufferable." Clearly, Hirohito sought to justify his decision to surrender by citing the dropping of the atomic weapons. He wanted to become the savior of the Japanese people. Hirohito wanted to obfuscate the issue of accountability, to prevent expressions of strife and anger, and to strengthen domestic unity around himself, to protect and raise the Kokutai. I find it interesting, the surrender declaration to the civilian population was not the same one sent to the military. On August 17th, Hirohito issued a second rescript to the soldiers and sailors throughout the Asia-Pacific. Here's a snippet of that. "Now that the Soviet Union has entered the war against us, to continue under the present conditions at home and abroad would only recklessly incur even more damage to ourselves and result in endangering the very foundation of the empire's existence. Therefore, even though enormous fighting spirit still exists in the Imperial Navy and Army, I am going to make peace with the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, as well as with Chongqing, in order to maintain our glorious national polity." The lesser-known rescript on August 17th to the Army and Navy specified Soviet participation as the sole reason for surrender, while maintaining the Kokutai as the primary aim. Dissembling until the end and even beyond, it was noted that the emperor presented two completely different justifications for his delayed surrender, but both statements were likely true. Months later, Hirohito said this about his decision to surrender. "The main motive behind my decision at that time was that if we did not act, the Japanese race would perish, and I would be unable to protect my loyal subjects." And please note he used the term tsukishi, which means children. "Second, Kido agreed with me on the matter of defending the Kokutai. If the enemy landed near Ise Bay, both Ise and Atsuza shrines would immediately come under their control. There would be no time to transfer the sacred treasures, the regalia of the imperial family, and no hope of protecting them. Under these circumstances, protection of the Kokutai would be difficult. For these reasons, I thought at that time that I must make peace, even at the sacrifice of myself. To this day, there exists this sort of childish argument. Did Japan surrender because of the 2 atomic bombs, or was it the Soviet invasion? It's a black or white situation for most. Of course, the answer is multivariable. Like all things in life, it's not black and white. But I also see that the vast majority of people completely overlook the influence of the Kokutai. Defending the Kokutai was Hirohito's #1 priority. The Soviets threatened it, communism threatened it, what Japan perceived to be Western democracy threatened it, American victory threatened it, and the destruction of Japan's social fabric threatened it. And I want to finish this episode off with this little quote that came about during this critical time period. Because on August the 12th, Hirohito came to the imperial family to tell them that he had made the decision to surrender. His uncle, Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, asked him whether the war would be continued if the Kokutai could not be preserved. And Hirohito replied, "Of course." And that is all for today. Again, a big thanks to all of you who have joined the YouTube membership or my Patreon account. You guys are all awesome. And this is the first time that we have, our Pacific War week-by-week listeners here, so I really hope you enjoyed this one. And please, if you liked it, let me know. You can comment on the Kings and Generals YouTube podcast channel. That's actually a pretty good place to leave comments because I always check it daily. Or hey, you could join the YouTube membership or the Patreon as well so you can get other goodies like this one. There's 29 more episodes. Actually, it's going to be about 31 because I'm currently writing one that actually deals with fantasy, not with the Pacific War. But stating all of that, this has been Craig from the Pacific War Channel, over and out.